Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on April 12, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. In general, if we talk about the line of contact, then after a massive missile strike, there is a small operational pause. There are offensive actions, but offensives, or rather to be more precise, progress and advances are not as significant, not as active as it was before the massive missile strike. Most likely, this is primarily due to possible negotiations that are currently being conducted behind the scenes between Zelensky, between the West, Putin, and so on and so forth. Even in sight, Alexander Grigoryevich Lukashenko was pulled up to this issue. He came to Moscow as a whole, discussed a large number of issues with Putin, and after that Lukashenko as a whole openly stated that everyone should be clear. I understand that on the 20th, as Lukashenko said, or on the 21st, Putin's term of office ends, after which, in general, no one will sign any peace agreements with him. That is, in fact, Ukraine still has options, the opportunity to sign some peace talks before the 21st or 20th of May, which will have legitimate force, and after which the war can stop, and then the countries will follow the peace talks that can be signed by a legitimate president. Since if Zelensky, for example, applies for signing agreements after the 21st of May, then most likely no one will sign anything with him, or first he will force elections to be held, after which the signing will take place. And this is an additional minimum of 3 to 6 months of hostilities, during which the situation can radically and maximally change in general, relatively far from favoring Ukraine. And before we go with you to the situation on the ground, to discuss all the things that are happening along the front line, I would first of all like to pay attention to the video somewhere on the border with Romania. Let's say this is the first video that we can, let's say the official video, the first frames, on which we can observe with you the successful crossing of the border, the Ukrainian border, most likely with Romania. In these frames, we see a young Ukrainian, a possible potential driver Bradley or Abrams, or an F-16 pilot, or a Marine from the 36th 7th, 37th 38th Brigades, but he was lucky. Despite, let's say, the rapid flow of the river, from the fact that he was blown away for several tens of possible meters downstream, he was still able to overcome this river and enter the territory of Romania, where of course nothing threatens him anymore. That's how this situation happened, the first single case. Surely in the near future, everyone who wants to avoid the mobilization of a future collapse, and it is unclear what in Ukraine, will try to find out where the Ryukin is so small, and in the next day, months, perhaps hundreds of cases, we will begin to contemplate from this direction, and by this time most likely the Ukrainian authorities will be able to close the shop. But in general, here he is the first lucky one, who was able to do it and avoid certain death for sure. Well, let's now turn to the situation on Earth. Footage is being published from Odessa, in the area of, say, the settlement of Alexandrovka. A train was hit on a railway bridge. A railway train with possibly some supplies, with military equipment, and as a result, both the bridge was destroyed and the railway transport was destroyed, which in general will lead to a small collapse in this direction in the near future. Surely it will take a lot of time to clear these rubble. Then we move with you to the Kherson direction. And we will start with you from, let's say, the Zaporozhye part of the same Kherson direction. The armed forces of the Russian Federation published additional footage of strikes on the Motor Sich plant, which occurred the other day. Let me remind you that as a result of the strike by the Russian command, the Russian aerospace forces managed to achieve significant results. Warehouses were destroyed, production sites were destroyed. Possibly missiles, possibly other military equipment. In general, the Russian Federation, Russian troops have repeatedly struck at this area. In general, if we look even from this angle at the frame, then most of the, let's say, industrial infrastructure is in more or less acceptable condition. Therefore, even despite the blow, of course, there is still a lot of work to be done by the Russian aerospace forces in order to minimize the military and industrial potential of this object itself. Then we move on to, let's say, the western Orkhov direction. There is a high activity of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, more precisely the gunners. It's still difficult to say whether this is a simple, let's say, counter-battery struggle, or whether it's just attempts to shoot and fish, to catch positions in the USU. Although every time some kind of activation begins, and sooner or later, if the Russian army starts it, it ends with a small breakthrough and occupied regular positions. According to the work itself, there is no news of the fighting, according to sources. Positional operations continue in the settlement itself. But it is worth paying attention to the fields located northwest of Verbova, from where information is constantly coming. News is constantly coming. And from this direction, shots of artillery strikes with the use of cluster munitions are received. In my opinion, it was ARBC 500, and now we can watch with you. Yes, this is ARBC 500, and that is, in general, we see, and, in general, it is in this direction, that the advance of Russian troops in the northwest of the village of Verbova is being viewed. And here is another frontier that the Russian army has run into. Now they are trying to process it first with cassettes, after which it makes sense to expect further progress, and attempts to finally close the issue of working on and fields. Then we are moving with you to the South Donetsk direction. Let's start with you from the Roman tactical bridgehead. Over the past day, the Russian army has managed to make significant progress on the southern outskirts of the harvest. At first, the Russian army repeatedly attempted assault actions, after which it was possible to dislodge the AFU from the position of the forest belts on the southern outskirts. After that, it was possible to take control of a small bridgehead along the forest belts themselves. The armed forces of Ukraine have repeatedly attempted a counteroffensive. All attempts at a counteroffensive were repulsed. Even the Ministry of Defense reports in its reports that the attempts of the counteroffensive of the 58th Brigade were unsuccessful, and repeatedly over the past days. And after the Russian army confidently gained a foothold on the new frontiers, the process of additional stripping began. Already the forest belts to the north, and the gradual advance of the Russian army from the southern part of the harvest to the central part. The main task in this case is to establish full control over farms, over households, buildings that are located in the southern part. There are quite large, extensive hangars here, probably already more or less prepared by the VSO for a long defense. And in general, we can state with you that the movement, the fact that the front in this direction has also begun to move, of course. This is not the Avdiivka operation. This is not even some kind of Western Avdiivka operation that is happening now. This is a small advance. Everything is essentially in accordance with the forces that are located here. Both from the AFU side, there is a small garrison here, and the Russian army is advancing north with small forces. On the northern outskirts of the same bridgehead, FABs are being struck at places of concentration of the armed forces of Ukraine. But little progress is gradually being made. In particular, among other things, successful counter-battery raids are regularly carried out. Raids with the use of lancets are destroyed by hidden, or in attempts to hide artillery. But in general, everything seems to be going on here, and gradually, the initiative is being intercepted by Russian troops. And, in general, the situation is developing in favor of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. In the South Donetsk direction, it is worth noting today the shots that were received in the interval. On the segment between Sweet and Water. In these frames, we can observe with you artillery strikes on retreating AFU fighters with the use of multiple launch rocket systems. Possibly in the sun. We will not look until the end due to the large number of wounded soldiers, but in general, the footage shows that the armed forces of Ukraine retreated from this line in the direction of northwest to Highway 0524 and were covered by artillery fire during the retreat. Perhaps in the near future, it is worth waiting to expect a further resumption of hostilities in order to drive up the gray zone and already reach the distance of an artillery or tank strike, mortar strike to Highway 0524. Novomykhailovka is silent. There were no changes. In fact, 2 weeks ago, even according to the configuration of the front, it was possible to boldly assert that Novomykhailovka would not withstand even the slightest push. However, despite all this, the city is holding on, or the Russian command does so and allows it to hold on. Drone strikes are being carried out, but an artillery strike is also being carried out, supplies are being destroyed. And there are no active military operations on the ground. Perhaps there is a regrouping. Perhaps the Russian command is waiting for the situation to stabilize. It will not stabilize, but will align in the southern direction, for example, Pavlovka, Nikolskaya, Ugledar, Vodiaya. After which the offensive will begin further on Bogoyavlenka and Kurikov with a wide front. Krasnogorovka. Today, footage was published from the Russian side of those assault actions, when it was possible to break through the defense of the AFU in the southern part, the southeastern part. In these frames, we see first the artillery training. The footage was shot with the Russian side. After conducting successful artillery training, heavy equipment went into the assault. Let me remind you that the settlement was stormed from 3 directions, or rather 3 waves, 3 different blows. As a result of these strikes, it was possible to enter and gain a foothold in at least 2 areas in the southern direction. It was possible to cross by rail, enter the private sector of the southeastern Krasnogorovka. And in general, as a result of these offensive and successful actions, the Russian army managed to overcome the largest, most powerful fortified area of the armed forces of Ukraine, which was built since 2000 of the 14th year, and gain a foothold in the southeastern part. We are talking to you about this fortified area. It was simply passed through the network, Ukrepov along the railway. And in general, now all these supports, black lines, are useless, since the Russian army is already in Tula and behind these fortifications. At the same time, after successful consolidation, the Russian command adopted the tactics of cleaning up the settlement, with the use of drones, with the use of ATOBs, with the use of FABs. In general, he works all the time for, let's say, the Russian army. There is nothing to answer in the USU. Literally a couple of days, we tried to shoot back with J-ladies, and they ended. If they decided that the city as a whole had already been surrendered, it makes sense to save for more important battles. Perhaps somewhere near Kharkov or near Pokrovsky. Therefore, now they are just waiting and enduring, when everything is flying and falling on the head of the AFU fighters. The first shots of the capture of a large number of armed forces, soldiers of the Armed Forces of Ukraine of the 25th Brigade. The one that was hastily dropped here from the Kopensky-Yuzhno-Kopensky direction to strengthen the position, began to arrive in the Avdiivka, West Avdiivka direction. However, the first fighters have already been captured. In general, some sources here report a call to the Natalovo-Umanskaya highway, some sources report a call to Samumansko. But so far we have not received either one or the second geolocation. It is worth paying attention to the footage of the Russian army's offensive north of Berdik, or rather the northern direction of Berdik, to the central part of Berdik, along, say, on the Ukrainian side of the Dernia River. And yet the Russian car ran into minefields, which suggests that, as a whole, the clearings here have been cleared, not running. Then only the first attempts the offensive began and Vitya's car was blown up, after which the paratroopers left, let's say the car, began to evacuate back in the direction of the forest belts. But in general the offensive took place approximately along this route, The car managed to reach approximately this direction, after which it hit a minefield. In other words, we see that there are attempts on the part of the Russian army to surround Berdik from the north as much as possible, and, in general, to reach this forest belt already, and in case of a successful offensive of a defense breakthrough. Establishing control under this red line, Berdik will already be in some kind of environment, in an operational environment. Yes, I think in general by this time, the APU will leave the settlement, and either at least roll back to its very, very western part and outskirts. That's the story going on here. Before we move on, of course, I would also like to pay attention to this video. In these frames, by the way, this is the second footage published during a special military operation, possibly by the same person. We can observe with you, perhaps a prototype, perhaps an industrial copy, weapons, rifles, as it is difficult to say, against drones. Here we have just seen the moment when the drone tried to fly at the fighter, but he fell under the beam, hit the beam. Into the capture zone, somewhere the point. That's it, that's the point. The drone flies APU directly at a soldier of the Russian army, after which he was grabbed and put on the ground. If we increase the number of updates, just a few days ago there was a similar picture. Here. It's not all in the Avdiivka direction. The icons are placed just completely randomly, so for clarity. In order to cram somewhere and understand that such things happen. There's another drone flying. It's trying to look for a victim in the forest, and apparently finds an APU fighter trying to strike. But it's clear that it flies incomprehensibly, goes astray, the signals are extinguished. At some point, pay attention to where the fighter pulls the barrel, that's where the disembodied person goes. Perhaps there has already been an interception of movement, or he is trying to synchronize his movements. With the movement of the infertile, it is difficult to say, but at some point, the infertile is simply led away. Perhaps by the fighter himself. A very interesting specimen. It is interesting to understand how effective it is. How it is able to cope with all types of possible drones that are present, have been involved and are being used during a special military operation, but in any case, it can really be some kind of breakthrough technology that can lead to the highest possible effect of advancing the Russian army in the next, say, part of a special military operation. Then we are moving with you to a new section of the Ocheretin front, Novokalinov ceramics. A large amount of information is coming from here, starting from the fact that the Russian army managed to break through the defense of the APU along the central street. Information about this progress has been received from Stepovaya Street for the second day. So far without any geolocation or confirmation on the ground. Here is approximately such a map, and such progress is now being drawn by cartographers analysts for this area. Although there has been no confirmation of this yet, but we will observe, perhaps something of this kind is happening now. Individual sources, very reliable, let's say, and famous sources, experts like Fish in general reports, including the advance of the Russian army from the southern part, at the moment, not only, say, parts of Polya Street to the east, have come under control, but also the whole south is currently under the control of the Russian army. But in general, as if even if there is progress, there really is, something like this is happening now. There is nothing surprising here, everything happens as a whole within the framework of some kind of logic, some kind of explanation. Pay attention, here let's say the impact of the Krasnopol at the intersection, but let's go back to the ceramics. Pay attention to where the main fortified areas of the armed forces of Ukraine are located. This is the intersection of the forest belts and further on Ocheretina. Here is a strong point from the 2014 year, it is very easy to see it even from satellite maps. And then the springs, Kalinova, and Sokol have already gone to Arkhangelsk, but here, let's say, between Alexander Polymer Ceramics, the nearest AFU stronghold, built back in the distant 2014 year, is located western Alexandropol, but the entire territory between the piece of iron and is essentially empty. The supports are minimal, or there are none at all, so there are no serious obstacles for the Russian army to advance here yet. Perhaps, as soon as they approach the first supports, the progress will stop, the alignment and processing of these positions will begin. Then we are moving with you to the Bakhmut-Artemovsky direction. There is also a similar story here. The Russian army came close to the main strongholds of the armed forces of Ukraine. It is already the distance of a small arms strike, but it is difficult to move further. Pay attention to these shots. We see with you the very hours of Yar, and we will be able to look at this network. A very, very well-developed network of trenches, strong points, and it's pointless to storm such positions in general, without, let's say, pay attention to how powerfully the APU dug in. And in general, it makes no sense to storm such an area without preliminary preparation at all. In general, it makes sense to wait for rotation. Here the fighters in the USU cannot stand indefinitely. It is necessary to establish, in sight it has already been established, absolute fire control over the channel. Over all crossings, which are probably already all explored, all are known. Let's say fighters came here, let's say a week ago, 2 weeks ago. They are not easy here for a year, but it's impossible. They need to be replaced sooner or later. And here it is possible at the moment of rotation, at the moment when the bull runs out, some supplies will run out. Perhaps it will be an attempt to strike. But now they are waiting, that is, they are starving. How long they will be able to stay in the forest in the eastern part. And maybe for a long time, maybe not anymore. But despite all this, in addition to just waiting, of course, the Russian army is eating up the gray zone. It is eating up. There is also a forest south of the clock, but the whole area is burned out by the impact of the sun. There is a sweep, in fact, let's say, the direction of the offensive from Ivanovskoye to the canal. While we see individual cartographers here have long painted over the area in red under the control of the Russian army. But today we receive footage that there is still a sweep going on. Among other things, all communication is suppressed and destroyed. Here, let's say, in this part of the clock, Yara is located along the Service Donetsk-Donbass channel. Either a cell tower was found on, say, a TV tower, APU equipment was found, perhaps Starlinks and communications. Communication, cameras, and equipment for drones, and this position was repeatedly hit with anti-tank guided missiles. And as a whole, all possible infrastructure was being destroyed. And in the near future, after all this work is done, some offensive attempts will begin. In general, if we talk about Bogdanovka, again, a promising direction for the offensive. We stopped receiving any updates on the map for promotion, and moreover, we even began to receive some footage of the APU's counteroffensive attempt on the lost positions. I remind you that during the last offensive, the Russian army managed to cross the fields, enter a separate building. And now the APU is already trying to counterattack. They may have regrouped, oriented themselves. That in general they retreated in vain and too quickly, but it's too late. The Russian army has already managed to set traps and mines here, and now any attempt at a counteroffensive leads to some losses. And in general, in, let's say, this direction, it is worth noting that in addition to the fact that there is an attempt to starve, an attempt to suppress all communication, all infrastructure. Among other things, naturally effective counter-battery fighting is carried out, engineering equipment is destroyed. Artillery is destroyed in hidden positions. Well, that is, it goes to work. Everyone is working tirelessly, and waiting, let's say, reduces the combat military potential in the right direction. As soon as it is lowered to a critical level, and the assault on the Yar itself begins at the very moment of the offensive operation. But in the area of Slavyansk, another howitzer of the armed forces was destroyed, which was hidden somewhere in the forest. Among other things, information was received that French legionnaires, in the number of 100 people, had already arrived in Slavyansk. Their main task at the moment is to prepare the city for defense. That's it. This is already, as it were, the first, let's say, signal. This is still, of course, an unofficial announcement there, but in general, Western partners are already beginning to pull up, let's say. And now the task is to check, inspect, and prepare the settlement of Slavyansk for defense. For such a serious with serious defense. Well, let's see how it turns out. In particular, in the direction near the settlement of Belgorod, a missile strike was carried out over the past day, as a result of which a warehouse or a temporary deployment point of the armed forces of Ukraine was destroyed. The Seversky direction revived slightly after a short operational pause. The cleaning and storming of the settlement with the use of unmanned vehicles resumed. While there is still no active phase on the ground with the use of infantry, purely takeoffs, discounts, and so on and so forth. Strikes and stripping of strong points of the armed forces along the railway continue, including with the use of multiple launch rocket systems, with the use of artillery, with the use of an infinite number of drones that fly without stopping. In general, preparations are underway, further preparations for the advance of the Russian army along the railway. Here, pay attention to the number of geolocations. In other words, for sure the railway is a priority for the Russian army, and some kind of activation should be expected here in the near future. A similar story is happening in Belogorovka. So far, there is no news on the situation outside the fortified area in Verkhnekamiansk. There are no more personnel confirming Russian control, but the sweep continues, including strong points northwest of the settlement of Disputable. With the adoption of multiple launch rocket systems, they hit forest belts, forest plantations. And here, for sure, in the near future, we should also expect an offensive operation on Belogorskivka. No changes yet. Perhaps the Russian army was forced to withdraw completely from the chalk. No more information was received, as at least from the eastern Ziba of the northern part, and the southern part is traditionally under tight control and in the presence of drones. Please note that every square meter was shot, shelled, dropped and hit with the use of free-flying equipment, but without any operation on the ground. Apparently, the Ukrainian fighter is very tightly and very deeply buried, and it's not so easy to knock him out from here. There is no news from the South Kapinsky direction, a complete lull. Neither the Apu counterattacks nor the Russian army. Perhaps we overestimated the Apu's counterattack capabilities. Perhaps they can't move far and deep from the Stallion. And in general, I ask you to pay attention to, let's say, the defensive lines. In fact, the Apu did not have time to build, and did not have time, could not, perhaps physically build long-term trenches on the Russian side of the Stallion. And pay attention to the dense network of strong points located on the Ukrainian side of the Stallion River. In other words, it will be quite a difficult operation, if it ever happens. At the moment, you can determine that while the task is to go to the Stallion, perhaps there will be some other plans and tasks in the future. There is no news on the North Cup direction. And in general, and from the latter, it is worth paying attention to the artillery strikes on the settlement of Slobozhanskaya along the border. The fighting continues, the exploration continues, the accumulation of resources and reserves continues. So far without any active operations on the ground. And that's it, dear friends.